let's go on and do this now. And we're going to demonstrate how to do a pivot table. And pivot table is this little icon here. You go into the insert section, you go to pivot table. Now, pivot table is really easy to activate on the new forms of Excel, because as soon as I punch in the pivot table, it immediately goes in and it gives me a location where it thinks the pivot table to be. And notice this one, it's going to cover the columns over here on the far upper left-hand corner. That's A1 demonstrated here. And then it's also going to go down here, and it's going to pick up all of my stuff all the way down here. Now it's going to pick up my averages, and I don't want it to do that, so I can go in and I can modify that from row 327 to 325. I'm going to do that. And then voila, this little thing here pops up on a separate new screen. Notice it's changed screens for me, and it's put me on a different screen. Now, here's what we're going to do with pivot table. Here's what I want to show you. So when I go into, and you'll notice the pivot table has this kind of box over here, and it has a little menu over here on the right-hand side of the page. So let's just take one of these score values, narrative scores. You all know what a narrative score on this. We're going to put it in the value column here. Now, all it tells us right now that it's got a sum for narrative scores. Now, I don't want a sum, so if I go take a left mouse control, sitting it right here, and if I go to value, field settings, I can also change that from a sum, a count, an average. Well, let's do an average. That's a good place to start here. And notice now that does the average. And I'm going to make this a little bit bigger over here so you can see it a little bit better. So it creates an average for me here of the narrative. Now you're probably saying, big deal, I already did that with Function Wizard. Why do I want to do that again? Well, let me show you what you can't do with Function Wizard. So if I go over here again on this side, and if I go to race, and I take the race icon and put it down into the row labels, I've immediately created an average for every single race group. Now, suppose that I go up here and I want to go to the sex column, and let's suppose that down to the column labels. Look over here now. Now I have, rather than one average in about 10 seconds, I've created multiple averages, almost. So I have a grand total for all averages for all female and male test takers. I have a grand total average for the entire group. I have averages for American Indian, male and female, Asian American, Black, Hispanic, multiple race, non-identified, Pacific. In other words, any category that you've labeled in the race column over here, because that's all it's going to pick up. So anything that you've picked up in the race column is going to pick up on there. So in other words, I can take any one of these columns here and I can compare these against anything else. So let's go back again. So we can do that. Here's something else I can do. I don't want averages that go to ridiculous extremes like this. So let's go in here and I go to value field settings, and it's, oopsie, it doesn't hang. I confused it. Let's just go to the number columns, and we're going to go to value field settings. Still thinks I want to do that. Format cells, number 2. Now I have averages just for 2 places. Now, in short, I can manipulate a lot of numbers with the pivot table that you can't do in other ways. Let me show you another demonstration that's custom designed for standard setting. And let's remove a bunch of these things from here. Just throw them into the dust. Now let's go back in again. And let's go in and let's Let's go back to our narrative score again and put it in the values column. Now let's do something really, and let's change that from sum. I don't want it to be a sum, and incidentally I can do this over here as well. I don't have to do it on this. I can go over here. Let's change it to count. And then let's take that same thing, narrative, and let's put it in the row labels. And look what I've done. I've now created a frequency distribution. In other words, I know that there was one kid in that group that had a score as low as 34, and one kid in here that had a score as high as 100. I know that 17 people had scores of 92, 21 had scores of 85. In other words, that's a complete frequency distribution is nothing more than the number of cases that scored at each value of the item here. So I can do that. Okay, now I'm a little more limited here, but I could go here and let's do sex. Okay, now I've broken it down. I now know the females were those two lowest scores. I know that 43, so now I've done a little disaggregation there. So in other words, shortly I've been able to break that down a little more completely than I did before. Now let's go to another thing that is really worth its weight in gold in terms of doing this, because this is actually an old version of a state reading test. And so suppose that I put performance and values here, and I have performance on both sides. So in other words, what I did was I simply took the term performance and I used it as a modifier as well as a value here. There we are. Now I know that whatever category 1 was, 67 people, category 2, well, let's, so we could go over and look at that and say, all right, category 1 was proficient, category 2 was basic, category 3 was satisfactory. In other words, my point is, I can let pivot table do the work. Now I can take this, I can modify this a little bit. Suppose I wanted to do this by race. Here are the number of scores by race. And then I can also do this by gender, by dropping it up at the top here. So look how I can use this. Now I don't like the way that looks. Okay, let's change it around here. It doesn't seem to be. So let's take performance and let's put performance as a column. So it's off the side. Let's do race down below like that. And let's go in and now let's put the gender in the report filter. What that does is I have to use a toggle switch. So there are the performance ratings for the females. There are performance ratings for the males. Here are the performance ratings for everybody. In short, Callie, what I want you to do is I want you to focus on two things here. I want you to be able to use pivot table. I want you to use the function wizard. I want to see some demonstration of that. Now, if you've got some examples of that, let me see them. That's all for now.